Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the wilds of upstate New York, this is episode 2 of the Superman on Film podcast. This is Mario-Francisco Robles, MFR here with you. And if you're watching the show on YouTube, you're probably going to notice I'm not in front of a green screen. No, I'm in front of a bunch of green trees. And even if you're just listening to the show, you're probably noticing a gust of wind that has come to greet me here, because here's what's going on, ladies and gentlemen, here in podcast land. You see, I thought it would be a very smart idea to launch a new weekly podcast 1 week before my annual camping trip. And, well, here we are. You know, it's episode 2. I launched last week. Episode 1 went off without a hitch. And thanks for everyone who supported episode 1, all the new subscribers, all the people who are just checking me out for the first time. Thank you. But for episode 2, clearly we have a brand new setting, and this is unique for me because I have literally recorded hundreds of podcasts now, hundreds of podcast episodes, and I've never done one out in the wild before. But I kind of felt like I needed to do this because I wasn't going to get a chance to properly record and edit and prepare an episode 2 before leaving, and I wasn't going to leave you hanging on week 2 of a new show. So as part of my, as kind of a token of the dedication I'm going to be bringing to this show from here on out, I just wanted to say not even being out camping is going to be enough to stop me. In fact, we even dealt with tornadoes in the area, and there are power outages. Here by my campsite, there is no power at all. So while I already have no service and no internet, the simple amenity that we did used to have of having running water and a shower we could have access to and charging our devices, even that is on the fritz. So we are literally actually roughing it. And even as I record this, I have to be mindful of my battery power on my laptop, because if my laptop dies, I can't recharge it and continue. So I'm going to have to pay a lot of attention to how that's doing, and hopefully I can record something that is of proper quality and with all of the information and analysis that you are looking for. But for right now, I also want to talk about today's episode topic, because see, last week I was talking about diving right in to the one that got us all started on all this, the one that began it all, Superman the movie. After spending episode 1 previewing the next Superman movie that's coming, I wanted to already start diving into the history. But an hour and a half into recording episode 1, I noticed I have a lot more to say about James Gunn's Superman and the birth of DC Studios and what the DCU itself is hoping to be for all of us fans. So I've kind of decided, instead of diving right into Superman the movie, episode 2 is going to now expand even further about James Gunn's vision, about the DCU as we know it so far, and what information we've really got and what expectations we should reasonably have, because many of us fans have been at this on-ramp before. Many of us fans have watched these projects come together and then fall apart over the years, right? There have been lots of different DC movies that we've heard casting news about, we've heard director hires for, we've heard so-and-so is writing something, and then we never see it come to fruition. So there's probably a little bit of skepticism for some of you as well that, hey, listen, we know James Gunn is starting a new franchise and he's going to launch Superman back into the heavens for us, but why should we have faith that the rest of his plans are going to work? Why should we have faith that this plan is going to work with Superman and Supergirl and what he's currently working on? We're going to start this episode off, though, with what every episode of this show will be starting off with: the latest news on James Gunn's Superman. So the latest news is this: after nearly 6 weeks of filming in the hometown of Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, the creators of Superman, after 6 weeks, James Gunn has announced that they are now closing up their filming in Cleveland. And he wrote a very lovely letter to the people of Cleveland, who he said could not have been more welcoming, could not have been more warm and excited to greet this new production of Superman, and to be so grateful and thankful that James Gunn and company decided to come film in their humble little city. He says he was treated with so much hospitality, so much respect and admiration. He said anyone would be lucky to film in Cleveland. And in particular, the people of Cleveland seem to be keeping the spirit of Siegel and Schuster alive. He seemed to feel a lot of good Superman energy in that city. And coming after 6 weeks of that, you might think maybe they're done or nearing done. But James Gunn did go on to specify over on Threads that we are not done yet. There's still a couple of weeks left. He urged us. It is a long shoot, but we're getting close. That's what James Gunn says as of now. So the big news is that all of those location pictures we've been seeing online, for those of you who are looking for those illicit pictures, those are going to stop now. Because we're leaving Cleveland, and chances are, I'm guessing a lot of the other stuff is going to be on a sound stage somewhere. I doubt they're going to set up shop in another city where we're going to see a lot more of, set pictures of things being shot on location. I'm guessing he got the bulk of his location stuff already handled in Cleveland and up in Norway when he was doing the Fortress of Solitude stuff. But, I think we're moving full on into the soundstage portion of things. And while that makes up like the news portion of things, the rumor mill has also been jumping since last week, because one of the locations that they were shooting at prior to concluding their time in Cleveland was at the very terminal that inspired the Hall of Justice. So it has people wondering, are we going to see a Hall of Justice in the Superman movie? Are they going to tease the formation of the Justice League? Or is there already a form of the Justice League already in play? Because remember, that's one of the interesting things about this Superman film and the DCU as a whole, that we're not getting some full-on origin that is setting the stage for everything. We are entering a world that is already got superheroes in it and has for some time. So it makes you wonder, this possible use of the Hall of Justice, is this something that will be a setup for the future? Or is there already a Justice League and maybe this Superman never made himself part of it for some reason? And we're going to see what gets him to join this league, We're going to have to see exactly how that goes, but that is one interesting rumor. And another adjacent rumor for an adjacent project has to do with Supergirl. Because you see, while that is based on Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, that book does include a bounty hunter, right? There, for those of you who've read the book, at some point Supergirl and her co-pilot, I forget the character's name now, but I have read the book and it's amazing. They enlist the help of a bounty hunter. And this gets interesting because it dates back to some of the very earliest rumors we ever got about the DCU. That basically certain characters or certain actors from the DCEU might be changing characters and sticking around. And one of those initial things was that Jason Momoa, the man who's been portraying Aquaman, Arthur Curry, on screen in some form since March of 2016, may actually continue to receive that DC paycheck. Even with the new owners and the birth of DC Studios, one of the very initial rumors was that Jason Momoa was now going to be recast as Lobo. And fans of Superman know all about Lobo, the intergalactic bounty hunter. And honestly, Jason Momoa was basically born to play a guy like Lobo. And he was cast against type for Aquaman, and he rocked it. I think he made Arthur Curry more cool and more current and more interesting than he's been in a very long time to those of us in popular culture who didn't read his books or grow up on him. But all things considered, that dude is Lobo. Just look at Jason Momoa, okay? So one of the rumors has been from the outset that he was going to do a pivot from Aquaman to Lobo, and now the rumor mill is in full steam, has gone full steam ahead into saying that not only has he been cast as Lobo, but his first appearance may very well be in Supergirl as the bounty hunter that they turn to for help. So that would be a pretty interesting way to introduce him, don't you think? Now, last week, I made reference to the fact that James Gunn, from the outset, has just been saying all the right things. And I realized in hindsight, a lot of the initial quotes that got me super excited and made me buy in immediately into this new vision for what DC Studios is going to be and what the DCU will be. I covered a lot of that on my old show, on the Fanboy podcast back in October and November of 2022, and I realized it doesn't really benefit my new listeners or viewers to just hear me say that he's been saying the right things. I'm going to go ahead and go back to some of the initial early quotes that I think maybe after all this time, some of you might have even forgotten at this point. The early quotes about what DC Studios itself is and what he felt facilitated the need for it. And there's this one quote in particular. It's gotten a little bit of controversy here and there, and I'm going to clean up the language a little bit because, unlike on the Fanboy podcast, I'm trying to keep this one clean. We're going to see how long I can keep that going. A passionate Latin man from New York can't always keep his mouth clean, but I'm going to try. This quote about James Gunn, from James Gunn, is about the history leading us to here with DC characters on film. He said, "The history has been bleep. It's been a real bleeped up journey for DC. I think that there was basically no one minding the mint, and they were giving out IP to any creatives that, smiled at whoever was in charge. There was never any real power given to the people in charge. And so somebody could always go over their head and do whatever they wanted. And we had the DCEU, which then became the Joss Whedon Justice League, but it also became the Snyderverse, which became this. And we have Wonder Woman, and we have Wonder Woman 1984, which doesn't even match what happened in Wonder Woman 1. And then we have the Arrowverse, and even us coming in with the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. And then all of a sudden, Batmite is a real guy. So, he was pointing out at the time that the ownership, the people in charge of DC for the last several decades, really, have kind of just been all over the place. And as a fan, those of us know that. We've seen all these weird stops and starts. We've seen the changes in direction. We've seen, okay, we're going to do Batman versus Superman, and we're going to hire Wolfgang Pearson. Okay, never mind that. Now we're going to do a Batman Begins, and we're going to do a Superman Returns. And then, okay, Superman Returns is going to be a continuation of old stuff, but Batman Begins is going to be an all-new thing. And then, okay, now we're going to get ready to launch Justice League Mortal in the middle of the Dark Knight trilogy. Now we're going to launch a different Batman and Superman and all this stuff in the George Miller Justice League Mortal. And then, okay, now we're not going to continue Superman Returns. We're going to relaunch Superman entirely, but now we're also going to forget about that Batman we just knew for the last 7 years, and we're going to meet another Batman in the sequel, but this Batman wants to kill Superman. Like, it's been, and then, after giving the okay to Zack Snyder to have Batman and Superman and Doomsday and do all this stuff, now the owners are going to decide we don't like this vision anymore, and now we're going to change everything with haste, and we're not going to delay any projects. We're just going to make everything still arrive on time, but be totally half-baked and overworked on and over-scrutinized, and now whatever this once was, it isn't anymore. And fans eventually noticed all of this crap, and that's why box office has slowly just collapsed like a flan in a cupboard over the last several years of the DCEU's existence. So I loved when James Gunn came in and said that, because it really did seem like anyone who asked nicely could make a DC movie. And it seemed like anyone could get anything kind of worked out or passed. And really the last example of that was Dwayne Johnson and the things I referred to in episode 1 when he tried to pull a crazy power play and take over DC as we know it and center the entire DC universe around everyone wanting to fight Black Adam. James Gunn probably realized somebody's got to take control here, because this is just chaos and these characters are suffering for it. And on the subject of the characters, he said, I wanted to take care of these characters. And we all know it's been an effed up road for many of them for the past few years, and things haven't been together. And I really thought it is a challenge, but I think it's a possibility to create something really wonderful with these characters. I can't go into politics. I can't do anything with science. So the only thing I can do for this planet is to create stories about love. And that's what I think that we can do over the next 8 to 10 years. And that, folks, that right there, that is the quote that got me immediately. Because it tells me that he's got a mission, he's got a vision, and he sees a purpose in all of this. You know, he thinks like, what can I do for this planet? Some people just make movies because it's a paycheck. They're just trying to, all right, you want me to make a movie about this thing? I'll do it. Pay me. I'll go buy a villa in Italy. This is my job. James Gunn is approaching this like, what can I do for this planet? And that's the thing, I can relate to that, because that might sound lofty, right? That might sound like overly ambitious. Like, come on, James, you're making a movie about a guy in a cape. How are you going to affect the world? Just go do your job and make it entertaining, But I live my life by the mantra of like, what can I do for the world, right? I'm limited in my scope. I live in one place and I have my family and I have my limited platform for what I can do. But I always, even within my limited confines, what can I do to make this planet better? I can make sure that things right where I am are good. I can raise good, kind, wonderful, considerate kids who are going to be good humans and help others in the future. When I go work my job, I can try to make sure that I'm being as present and as of service as possible, so that what I'm doing is creating a better world around me. If I'm just being kindness and love and goodness within my own little pocket universe of Mario life, then little by little, the idea is if we are all just doing our very best within our own little pocket universes, the world will become a better place. And for James Gunn, a filmmaker, to look at it like, this is my mission. I'm a filmmaker. I've been given this responsibility to tell stories that are going to be viewed around the world. And listen, I can't become a politician and try to create peace that way. I can't solve hunger through science, and I can't, but I can tell beautiful stories that help bridge gaps between us. That's James's general mantra behind all this. And to me, like for a big softy like me who loves seeing the love and the emotion and the hidden meanings and morals and stuff that goes into a story, that just right out of the gate tells me, oh, James Gunn is approaching this like he's telling stories of love. And I know that may sound funny, right? Because does that mean that every movie's going to be a love story? No. But if you think about it, most stories in some way, shape, or form are a story of love. It may not be a romance, but it could be the love that a father feels for their child as they go to try to save them from something. It could be the story of the love between two friends on a road trip movie and all the things they go through. A coming of age story is a story of love between the coming of age person and their family, and how their trials and tribulations over time, they end up growing up together and the movie comes to its nice conclusion. Like love really is at the heart of most of our favorite stories, because it's about the bond amongst the characters and what these characters are willing to do for each other. At the end of the day, you can distill a lot of different movies, a lot of different stories down to, at its base, that story is about love and kindness and what people are willing to do for those they love. So even your average superhero movie that's going to be filled with action and cool special effects and all that, if you're approaching it from the outset, like we're trying to make the world a better place and we're trying to show good and evil in a way that is easy to understand and maybe has a message or something is going to make someone walk out of the theater that day wanting to be a little bit nicer or wanting to be a little bit more, heroic, helpful. I'm going to stand up for someone who I see being wronged. Listen, I know I get a little idealistic and I can get a little sappy at times. And if you're new to me, welcome. I got a big old heart. I wear it on my sleeve, and that's why I love Superman. So get ready for lots of sappy little stuff like what I just said. While that is like the emotional foundation for what the DCU is and for what James Gunn hopes to do with these characters and with this new creative freedom he's been given with this DC universe, what about the actual business sense for what is DC Studios? Because remember, folks, there's never been a DC Studios. DC's always just been like an office at Warner Brothers Pictures. It's always just been like one little department within Warner Brothers Pictures. It's never been its own standalone entity where everything is housed under one central boss. And that's why creating cohesion amongst all of that has been darn near impossible. So James Gunn, right at the outset, and Peter Safran, his production partner, seem to understand that one of the very first things we need to do is get everything in one place. Because just to kind of recap, too, just to give you a little bit of history about the other side of the fence, right? The big comparison when it comes to DC is Marvel, right? And prior to 2008, does anyone remember what Marvel's cinematic footprint was like? It was all over the place. Everything was scattered. There was no Marvel Studios. And unlike DC, where Warner Brothers has owned DC since the late 1960s, Marvel wasn't owned by one particular major entity. So what they did was they sold off their characters to various different film studios. And they would license the characters off to various different video game makers. It was all very like a la carte. And that's why you had, Sony had the Spider Universe, Fox had the X-Men universe and the Fantastic Four universe. You had Hulk over at Universal. And then you had TV shows that were loosely based on Marvel things, but not really connected. Everything used to be all over the place. And then in around 2007, this is all the top of my head, folks, but somewhere in like 2007, maybe 2006, because they needed some time to actually make the movies that were coming out in 2008, they announced that finally Marvel Studios has come into some money. And they're going to launch their own, in earnest production company. And their goal is to get all the characters together and to tell one big cohesive story. And they announced in 2006 that we were going to get 4 solo movies followed by an Avengers movie. And it was all very exciting, but it was the first time that stuff had ever happened. So before there was a Marvel Studios, there was no way for them to do this. Everything was all over the place. And to a much lesser extent, even though Warner Brothers has owned DC outright, Warner Brothers is huge, and they've had lots of mergers themselves over the years. And they've never even, apparently, they never thought maybe we should make all the DC comic stuff work together in somehow. All the visual moving media. Obviously, DC Comics is its own thing, and that's fine. That is the literature. That's the paper. But all of the actual moving media, no one ever thought maybe we should make all of this work together since, it's all stuff that people are watching and playing and listening to. It should have a coherent vision. So up until now, that hasn't, it took forever for Marvel to finally get that. And now DC Studios is hoping to finally have that because up until now, it never happened. So here's what Peter Safran describes it as. He says, DC Studios is just a standalone studio production entity, and it's unprecedented because it's the first time ever that all film, all television, live action, animation, and gaming is all centralized under one creative vision. So that right there, huge. That is a game changer for us fans, that now there's going to be one main boss overseeing all the DC content that we watch on television or on, play in our systems or watch on the big screen. I think that is going to change everything. But even aside from what I think, one huge change this makes to things is DC Studios can now exist as its own entity. And that's important. Because remember, when Warner Brothers and Discovery merged, that was after Warner Brothers and AT&T had merged. And that was after Warner Brothers, there had been several mergers, right? And there's been this fear all along that Warner Brothers is just going to sell again. So why should we get excited about any of this DCU stuff if the ownership might change again? This is just the stuff that the new ownership wants. David Zaslav, Warner Brothers Discovery, they're the ones who hired James Gunn. They're the ones who got all this going. But what if David Zaslav gets fired next year and a new company comes in and buys it all, right? Well, Having DC Studios now as its own entity now means it can be sold off as its own piece, as its own thing. So should the situation arise where now they got to talk about mergers or they got to talk about selling off parts of their IP, Warner Brothers Discovery can now offer up DC Studios as its own complete package to other streamers, to other film companies. DC Studios can now be on its own. It has been siloed off and separated from Warner Brothers Pictures. And while Warner Brothers Pictures will probably never want to get rid of, while Warner Brothers will never want to get rid of their proper film studio, DC Studios might be something valuable they could sell one day. And that also basically ensures that whatever James Gunn is working on is going to survive no matter what's going on with Warner Brothers, Discovery, and any other future mergers. So I just wanted to put that out there too, because there has been this I'm skeptical. I'm not going to get into any of this stuff because who knows, Warner Brothers might get sold off next year and the new boss will change everything. But now that DC Studios is in fact its own thing with its own two-boss system of James Gunn and Peter Safran, it basically means that it limits any potential for that to happen. Because what will likely happen is DC Studios itself will remain intact, but they may just change who they're directly answering to. But as long as what they're doing is successful, they're going to be just fine. So I just wanted to put that out there too, because there has been those kinds of concerns over the years about why should we buy in? Why should we think this is going to happen? We've kind of been through this before, but this is different because there's never ever been a DC Studios before. And since I brought up Marvel Studios in comparison to DC Studios, and since I brought up earlier what Marvel has been able to do as opposed to what DC has been able to do, let's also talk about what they say are the differences, what Peter Safran and James Gunn say are the differences between the DCU and the MCU. Because I think this is interesting too, and I love what they had to say, because again, they always say the right things. But here's what James Gunn said about the differences between the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the DC Universe. I think that we have a lot of differences. I think that one of the reasons why I love DC is it really is another universe. It's an alternate world. In Marvel, generally, it's New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and then every place else in the world is a fictional universe for some reason. Here at DCU, we have Metropolis and Gotham and Themyscira and Atlantis, and all of that is sort of another fictional universe. All of that. And this is the world that we're creating. We're coming into a world where superheroes exist and have existed for some time in one form or another. And that's the universe. And so we are telling a big, huge central story, except for I think we're a lot more planned out than Marvel from the beginning, because we've gotten a group of writers together to work that story out completely. But we're also creating a universe that is like Star Wars, where there are different times, different places, different things, and like Game of Thrones, where characters are a little bit more morally complex. So everything right there that's everything that I would want the DCU to be in contrast to the MCU. I've always loved that DC universe seems to be filled with gods and aliens, while Marvel universe has always been average Joes who are given powers and have to figure out, what do I do with this now? Unless you're Thor and a few other ones, obviously. But, Marvel always felt more like this is regular people who suddenly have powers and have to figure out what to do with them. Whereas DC, you have it's mythological, it's gods, it's good and evil. And a lot of the stories you could almost tie back to Greek mythology. To me, I've always seen them that way. So to have James Gunn basically illustrate that perfectly, we're not dealing with New York and Chicago. We're dealing with Metropolis and Gotham and Themyscira and Atlantis. I'm yes, we are in a mystical world where there's, the fantasy is kind of baked into everything. So I love that. I love what they had to say about that. And then, when it comes to who's building it out, right? Because he has a team, and he's referenced there being a team, and he's referenced that he's already got basically all the beats of the story all worked out. So who is he working with on this? And James Gunn has let it be known that, well, here's the quote. He says, Tom King, comic book writer, Tom King has been my partner throughout all of this. He was giving me answers to crap before I took the job. So me, him, Crystal Henry, who worked on Watchmen and is doing Waller, Christina Hodson, who wrote The Flash, Drew Goddard, who you guys should probably know, Jeremy Slater, who just did Moon Knight, that group of people we've been meeting with and, putting all of this together. So he's had a very interesting team of both people from the comic book world, but people who've also really successfully and intriguingly adapted comic book stories for the screen. So another big win, another big win, if you ask me. And then in terms of, why is he the man for the job? What is it that should give us fans reason to trust Mr. Gunn at this point, that he's going to be able to see this through? He was asked this, and James said, the biggest difference is I've done it. So I started Guardians 1 with a story of what that trilogy was, where it started and where it ended. And that story is just a smaller version of doing this. I've been inside a company that did it very well, but it's very different than us. Marvel didn't have everything completely worked out ahead of time, but they did a lot of things really well, one of which is not giving up. And really, I love that about Kevin Feige and Lou D'Esposito and the whole gang. I've seen them turn bad movies into okay movies into good movies, and good movies into great movies, because they do not effing stop. They give it whatever it needs to make it as good as it can possibly be until the 11th hour. And they'll be editing the day before the premiere. It's a lot. Too much. But so he gave his flowers. He gave credit where it was due. But he is contrasting greatly what DC Studios is hoping to do compared to what Marvel Studios is going to do. And I, for one, am loving all the differences, and I can't wait to see how it all actually plays out in action, because one thing is saying it, the other thing is actually doing it, right? Another intriguing answer that James Gunn gave early on is in reference to the fact that this thing can go on forever. And that's interesting. I bring this up because many years ago, when Superman Returns faltered while Batman Begins succeeded, even though it's funny, box office-wise, they made very similar. But because one cost a lot more and one just seemed to have a lot more potential for where to go, Batman Begins to this day is considered the hit, while Superman Returns is considered the flop. When you go back and look at it, they're really not that far apart. But I digress. At that time, director Christopher Nolan was basically given the keys to the kingdom. He was given full reign over what he wanted to do with Batman, because everyone really embraced Batman Begins and his vision for that. And what Christopher Nolan did, even though this was 2005 when Batman Begins came out, we were at the very early stages of Hollywood's fascination with cinematic universes, with franchises that can cross over into other franchises. We were at the very beginning of that. Marvel hadn't announced their exciting Avengers plan yet. Fox hadn't figured out, it might be cool to have X-Men and Fantastic Four do stuff together. A lot of different... Star Wars hadn't gotten all their stuff going yet either, with the TV series and all the prequels and sequels and stuff they've been working on for the last 10 years. So it was a simpler time. And yet, Christopher Nolan still just kind of opted to go with, I'm not going to worry about any of that stuff. I'm going to tell 3 Batman stories, and they're going to be self-enclosed. And when I'm done with The Dark Knight Rises, there's no more stories for that Batman. I'm essentially going to kill him off. I'm going to make him old and injured, and I'm going to make it seem like there's no more Batman for you. And it was one of the ways, I guess, he wanted to make sure that no one could come in and do a 4th Batman movie that now pisses on the legacy of the previous 3 movies. And maybe it was just a way to just kind of keep the quality control, because he knew Warner Brothers was crazier than a bag of cats. And they were probably going to hand off his Batman universe to someone who would do who knows what to it. But he made that decision, even as more information came in, right? Because when 2008 rolled around and The Dark Knight came out and made over $1 billion and was nominated for Best Picture, and all of a sudden the entire world was very intrigued with comic book movies, all of a sudden in 2008 Nolan had an option here. He had, clearly Warner Brothers was trying to nudge in the direction of team-ups and a larger universe, because Nolan got the Batman Begins job because Warner Brothers wanted to do Batman versus Superman in 2001. So the studio had been begging for something where we could have our heroes interact. But with this new creative freedom, he said, forget all that. I'm not doing that. My Batman will exist on his own. So that's why, George Miller got the green light to make Justice League Mortal while the Dark Knight trilogy is currently happening, right? And that falls apart. And again, he's making The Dark Knight Rises. And Mr. Nolan had the option if he wanted to. He didn't have to jump the timeline into the future and make Batman old. And he didn't have to end it in a way where this really is the end of the story. But he stuck to his guns. Even as Marvel had now shown that the cinematic universe thing could be huge and hugely successful at that, if done right, Christopher Nolan stubbornly stuck to, I'm going to give you a Batman trilogy that the world is going to love and want more of, and then I'm going to take it all away and you can't make more. And for fans like me, that always just seemed like a wasted opportunity, because Christian Bale's Batman could have lived on if Nolan hadn't done that, right? And he had launched Man of Steel. We could have had a world where Henry Cavill's Superman got to know an older, grumpy Christian Bale. And they even could have done the Batman versus Superman thing. And it would have made more sense with this older, more skeptical, cantankerous Bruce that we've met in the Nolan movies. But again, he made this decision to end everything after Dark Knight Rises, so that if anyone else wants to do a Batman movie after this, you pretty much have no choice but to start over again. And when it comes to the DCU, we keep hearing this thing about the greatest story ever told. And we keep hearing that James Gunn has it all worked out, that it has a beginning, middle, end, that he knows what the DCU is going to be. So you might think, so is that it though? Is he going to tell these 8 to 10 years of stories he keeps promising? And then that's just it? And then we're going to start from scratch again in 10 years? Well, here's a quote that even I have forgotten about at times as I think about this stuff. Early on in the process, he said, oh, by the way, I should preface, the question was about how much of it do you have planned out in advance? And it was part of his answer to this that I found revelatory. He said, we're not making it up as we go along. The 8 to 10 year plan is 2 chapters. And there's an ending to our basic story that we tell there, but it's not the ending of the universe. So now, will Peter and I be here beyond that time? I'm already tired, and it's been 2 months. But those first 2 chapters are worked out, and then it can go on from there. So in case you didn't catch that, that means that, yes, he has the whole story mapped out, worked out. He knows where this is going, but he's going to leave the universe in such a place where if future creators want to come in now, and now that that arc is done, I want to tell another wave of DC stories using these heroes, they'll be able to do that. He's not going to end things in a conclusive, that's a wrap, folks, kind of way. So I just, as someone who lived through watching Nolan make the decision to put his Batman alone on an island, and then watched how I felt that really kind of hobbled the DCEU's ability to kind of begin on the right note. I'm really, really relieved to know that Mr. Gunn has a big, wonderful, sweeping, epic story But he's also going to leave the universe and these characters in such a place where that if another wonderful writer, director came in, they could also use these characters and tell some more stories and take them perhaps in directions we hadn't seen in those first 8 to 10 years. Because that's what these characters can do, right? They've been around for decades and decades. They endure, and they should be left in such a way that a future creator can step in and do more with them. I'm over this idea that now we're going to close this off and now the next guy has to start from scratch again. I don't like it, and I'm glad we're not having to worry about it this time. And the last of Gunn's original comments that I'd like to hit on have to do with former Superman Henry Cavill. Because while I did address that in Superman 1, I kind of glossed over it. You know, it really was quite a almost traumatic experience for many fans of his when this Black Adam thing happened, because it gave the only sense of false hope that we were going to get him. Because just to recap, not only did Henry show up in the post-credit sequence of Black Adam, but there were articles in the trades within days following that about him taking meetings with producer Charles Roven about a Man of Steel 2. And then he went and did a big on-stage interview with Josh Horowitz of the Happy, Sad, Confused podcast, where in front of a rapt audience of studio fans, he made all kinds of promises for the kind of Superman stories he plans to tell. And I covered all that on the Fanboy podcast way back in the day. But it was quite a ride to go through, because even for me, I was like, good. Henry deserves a Man of Steel 2. I always felt like if he could have continued on from where Man of Steel left him, if we could really just go back to where Man of Steel ended and continue from there, I thought that version of Superman had a lot of legs. There was a lot of places he could have gone. But instead, we ran right into The Dark Knight Returns meets The Death of Superman meets Injustice, and it just became a whole other thing, So when they announced this, I was rejoicing. I was happy that Henry was going to get a chance to really kind of take his time and tell some more classic Superman stories to really add to his legacy as the character. But then, lo and behold, the James Gunn announcement came, and then everyone wondered, is he going to bring Henry along for his new Superman movie? But then he quickly had to make clear that he's not. And it created a lot of confusion early on. Like, does this mean that Henry was fired? Like, why did they announce this? How could they do this to Henry? And, it created a lot of backlash against James Gunn right out of the gate. It made people feel like I have ill will towards this new Superman movie before they've even started filming because of what they did to Henry. But one thing you should understand, if you're new to following this situation, or even if you've been following it and no one has quite presented it to you this way, that was all part of a power play. That was all just Dwayne Johnson using his mutual connection with Henry, because Dwayne's ex-wife, Danny Garcia, is his manager and also Henry Cavill's manager. And they are her two most high-profile clients. That's her big thing. Danny Garcia, for years, she had Dwayne Johnson and she had Henry Cavill as her clients. And while making Black Adam and teasing different Superman, Batman confrontations from the comics, Dwayne Johnson saw an opportunity there to step into the power vacuum and try to become the center of it all. But poor Henry was the real victim of it all. Because while Dwayne can now just pivot over into his next big Hollywood project, and his PR machine is just going to continue making him seem like the coolest, most generous, most awesome, most genuine dude that's ever walked the face of the earth, while he can just go on to that, Henry's the one who was out there talking about his Superman movies and is now left with the cape in his hands. And on the contrary, not even getting to ever put it on again, he has to hand the cape totally back. So Henry was the real victim of what happened there with Dwayne Johnson. And when asked about it, James Gunn just said, it's important to say that Henry Cavill was not fired. Henry was just not hired to be Superman in my Superman movie. There was never a deal for another movie. So that means that Henry was out there making these promises and doing these interviews, but there was never anything signed on the dotted line. All of that was contingent on Black Adam being a success and creating enough positive word of mouth that all of a sudden, whoa, we have to make this Black Adam versus Superman movie. But that didn't happen. But that, to me, is also one of the most crazy wrinkles in all of this. That just like at the very beginning of this episode, the quote I said about how everything has been effed up, how James Gunn was saying that no one was minding the mint, no one was making sure that all this stuff made sense and was coherent. You know, James Gunn, by the time Henry had shot his cameo, James was already writing a script for a Superman reboot. Like, how does any of this make sense? By the time Henry donned the suit and filmed the cameo and was seen by audiences in October of 2022, James was already close to closing his deal as the head of DC Studios, knowing full well, I'm not going with Henry. You know, he observed as Warner Brothers Pictures was continuing to mismanage DC. And so when he got the job, he just had to make it clear, listen, we're not going to keep trying to make this stuff that clearly hasn't been working work again. We're just going to start over again. And we can't have Henry carry over because that's just going to create a lot of confusion. And that just makes perfect sense for a lot of us and is very, very troubling for others of us. But for anyone else out there who at this stage of the game still thinks that Henry was fired or that Henry was mistreated by James Gunn and DC Studios, I'm sorry, that's just not factually the case. Henry was used as a bargaining chip in a really, really ruthless negotiating ploy by Dwayne Johnson, and then he ended up paying the price. And by the way, he has since dropped Danny Garcia as a manager. I wonder why. And while that just about does it for episode 2 of the Superman on Film podcast, I wanted to go ahead and shout out the Kryptonian Orphan. Because yes, I got my very first review already. The show is brand new. We've already been rated several times, and I got a review over on Apple Podcasts. And similar to what I've done on previous shows, anytime I get a review, I'm going to read it here on the air, and I'm going to thank you. Because listen, your support is the main reason I do this. You've noticed there's no ads, right? And that may change. I got to figure out a way to make a little money. But for the time being, this is just a labor of love, a passion project, and I run on your good vibes and your support and your spreading the good word to your friends about me. That's really why I do this. I want to make sure that I'm connecting with fellow fans out there, and that is the real joy of this. So when I hear that I'm having an impact on you, it makes me want to keep recording. So here's this, my very first review for the Superman on Film podcast. He titled it Up, Up, and Away. Of course, with a name like the Kryptonian Orphan, you know that I'd have to review this one. This dude knows his stuff about all things soups. If you're a fan like me, you'll be eager to listen to pods like this. During times like these, it's nice to have a little positivity out there as a welcome distraction. Thank you, Kryptonian Orphan. If anyone else wants to take some time to leave me some words of encouragement and support, I would love that. Please like, rate, review, and subscribe today. The Superman on Film podcast is now available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and wherever else premium podcasts are found. And of course, right here on the YouTube channel. If you're watching here, thanks for watching the show. Hopefully you enjoyed the lovely, tranquil woods behind me. And hopefully the sounds of the wind and the rustling nature didn't create too many distractions for you out there listening in podcast land. And so, until next week, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up, and away.